Today we're going to begin Unit 3 of the course, which examines the United States' role in the world. We'll examine how and why the United States entered the arena of world politics at the end of the 19th century, and how the United States, for better or worse, shaped world order in the 20th century and up to our current times. As we go through this unit, keep the following questions in mind. What accounts for the increased importance of foreign policy concerns in American politics in the closing years of the 19th century? What factors projected America into world affairs? And how did the United States overcome the isolationist tendency that prevailed in American foreign policy for nearly the first 100 years of the country? And what are the consequences of continuing to remain engaged in the world? That Americans were looking to extend their frontier at the turn of the century was nothing new. Before the Civil War, Americans had repeatedly extended the frontier, but they had largely done it in what is today continental United States. They bought Louisiana, annexed Florida, Oregon, and Texas. They pushed Indians from the path of white migration westward. They seized California and other western areas from Mexico and acquired southern parts of present-day Arizona and New Mexico from Mexico. By the 1880s, however, many Americans advocated to move beyond the borders of the United States, and there were several reasons to do so. For many supporters of expansion, Americans had a God-given obligation to spread the blessings of their superior institutions to less fortunate peoples across the world. And this is a highly presumptuous view, to be sure, but it certainly helped propel the United States as a world power. As early as 1885, in his popular book, Our Country, Congregationalist minister Josiah Strong urged Protestants to proselytize overseas. He predicted that the American Anglo-Saxon race, which represented the largest liberty, the purest Christianity, the highest civilization, in his words, would spread itself over the earth. Such arguments were grounded in American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States had a unique destiny to foster democracy and civilization. As Strong's exhortation suggested, racism and popular notions of Anglo-Saxonism and the white man's burden helped justify the imposition of U.S. rule on what he referred to as backward populations. Even while the United States and Britain continued to tangle over various issues, Americans hailed the blood ties and common heritage of the English-speaking peoples. According to Anglo-Saxonist ideas, Americans and Britons stood together at the top of a hierarchy of races, superior in intellect, industry, and morality. The idea that Americans would advocate for the Anglo-Saxon race or rule over foreign people of color should come as no surprise. Remember, this was an era when, at home, most American Indians and Asian immigrants were denied citizenship, when Chinese laborers were banned from entering the country, when most Southern blacks were disenfranchised and treated like second-class citizens, and when many states across the country erected Jim Crow laws. But racism was just one justification for expanding America's empire. Imperialists also argued that free land on the western frontier was dwindling, and thus new outlets needed to be found for American energy and enterprise. In 1893, a young historian named Frederick Jackson Turner, pictured here, reviewed recent census data and proclaimed the end of the frontier. Up to 1890, he wrote, a clear westward moving line had existed between civilization and savagery. The frontier experience, Turner argued, shaped Americans' national character. It left them a heritage of coarseness and strength combined with acuteness and inquisitiveness, as well as restless, nervous energy. He did not say a new frontier had to be found overseas, but he did claim that American energy will continually demand a wider field for its exercise. Coming at a time when demographers were claiming, incorrectly as it turned out, that the continental frontier had closed, Turner's writings aroused concerns that the nation's fundamental values were in jeopardy. Such fears produced a social malaise that gripped the United States through much of the decade. The crisis was evidenced in various ways. The growing militancy of labor, there were 1,400 strikes in the year 1894 alone, and the use of force to suppress it produced a threat to social order that frightened solid middle-class citizens. The violence that accompanied the 1892 Homestead Massacre in Pennsylvania, which we discussed earlier in the class, where private security forces battled workers, and the Pullman strike in Illinois 2 years later, in which 13 strikers were killed, was particularly unsettling. There were also plenty of legitimate economic reasons to expand overseas. New technology such as tractors, machines, factories, and assembly lines that had developed during the industrial period meant that Americans could produce more goods than they could consume. To keep the economy strong, Americans needed to trade overseas. Business leaders therefore began to look outward, advocating an activist approach to world affairs, emphasizing the supposed benefits to the country's domestic health. This was particularly relevant during the 1890s, when the United States ended up in an economic depression. Many believed expanding overseas was the answer to the hardship. Imperialists also saw expansion as the answer to growing concern about issues of manhood during the decade. The Depression of the 1890s robbed many American men of the means to support their families. A rising generation that had not fought in the Civil War and remembered only its glories increasingly feared that industrialism, urbanization, and immigration, along with widening divisions of class and race, were sapping American males of the manly virtues deemed essential for good governance. The emergence of a militant women's movement demanding political participation further threatened men's traditional role in U.S. politics. For some American men, a more assertive foreign policy, war, and even the acquisition of colonies would reaffirm their manhood, restore lost pride, and legitimize their traditional place in the political system. Americans also wanted to become involved in world affairs because they saw the United States in competition with the other great powers of the day for markets and natural resources. By the 1870s, most of Europe's powers were carving up Africa and large parts of Asia for themselves. As the century turned, France, Russia, and Germany were spending heavily on modern steel navies, challenging an overextended Great Britain. In Asia, a rapidly modernizing Japan expanded at China and Russia's expense. Observant Americans argued that the United States risked being left behind if it failed to join the scramble for territory and markets. Republican Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts claimed that civilization and the advancement of the Anglo-Saxon race were at stake. Such thinking encouraged Americans to reach beyond the continental United States for more land, markets, cultural penetration, and power. U.S. Naval Officer Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan, seen here, echoed the statements voiced by Lodge. In his book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, published in 1890, Mahan urged the United States to enter the naval race with the great powers, observing that naval power had been essential to past empires. So, too, he contended the United States must compete aggressively for world trade, build a large merchant marine, acquire colonies for raw materials, markets, and naval bases, and construct a modern battleship fleet, the arm of offensive power, which alone enables the country to extend its influence outward. Such moves would ensure U.S. prosperity by keeping sea lanes open in times of war and peace. Mahan's ideas provided a persuasive rationale for the new battleship navy and a more aggressive U.S. foreign policy. Imperialist sentiment in Congress and throughout the nation was also being fueled by jingoism. Jingoists were nationalists who thought that a swaggering foreign policy and a willingness to go to war would enhance their nation's glory. This predatory band of nationalism emerged not only in the United States, but in Britain, France, Germany, and Japan as well. The anti-imperialist editor of The Nation, E.L. Godkin, exclaimed in 1894, "The number of men and officials of this country who are now mad to fight somebody is appalling." Spain's behavior in Cuba in the 1890s gave those men and officials the war they sought. They triggered a noisy nationalism and outwardly emotional displays of reverence for the flag. For some Americans, a belligerent foreign policy offered a release for pent-up aggressions and diversion from domestic difficulties. Perhaps more than any other event, the Spanish-American War helped transform the United States into a world power. The very title of this war is somewhat of a misnomer, of course, since it omits Cuba and the Philippines, both key players in the conflict. The war grew out of a revolution in Cuba that was itself in many ways a product of the island's geographical proximity to and economic dependence on the United States. U.S. tariff policies played a key role in the origins of the conflict. The 1890 Reciprocity Treaty with Spain sparked an economic boom on the island. But the 1894 Wilson-Gorman Tariff, by depriving Cuban sugar of its privileged position in the U.S. market, inflicted economic devastation and stirred widespread political unrest. Revolutionary sentiment had long smoldered. In 1895, exiles such as the poet, novelist, and patriot leader José Martí returned from the United States to foment rebellion. Concerned about the possible U.S. designs on Cuba, Martí and Máximo Gómez sought a quick victory through scorched earth policies, seeking to turn Cuba into a desert and by doing so drive Spain from the island. Spanish General Valeriano Weyler, also known as Butcher Weyler, retaliated with his brutal reconcentrado policies, herding peasants into fortified areas where they could be controlled. The results were catastrophic. 95,000 people died from disease and malnutrition. On the other side, weather, disease, and Cuban arms took a fearsome toll on young and poorly prepared Spanish forces. An estimated 35,000 of them killed each year. The rebels used the machete with especially terrifying effect, littering the sugar and pineapple fields with the heads of Spanish soldiers. From the outset, this brutal insurgent war had an enormous impact in the United States. Since Jefferson's day, Cuba's economic and strategic importance had made it an object of U.S. attention. Like Florida, Texas, and Hawaii, the island was Americanized in the late 19th century. The Cuban elite was increasingly educated in the United States. By the end of the century, the United States dominated Cuba economically. Exports to the United States increased from 42% of the total in 1859 to 87% in 1897. United States investment have been estimated at $50 million, trade at $100 million. The war threatened American-owned sugar estates, mines, and ranches, and the safety of U.S. citizens. A junta located mainly in Florida and New York and led by Cuban expatriates, some of them U.S. citizens, lobbied tirelessly for Cuba Libre, sold war bonds in the United States, and smuggled weapons onto the island. Cubans naturalized as U.S. citizens returned to fight. Not surprisingly, Cubans had mixed feelings about U.S. assistance. The Yellow Press, so named for the Yellow Kid, a popular cartoon character that appeared in its newly colored pages, helped make Cuba a cause célèbre in the United States. The mass circulation newspaper came into its own in the 1890s. The New York dailies of William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer engaged in a fierce head-to-head competition with few restraints and fewer scruples about the truth. Not too different than what the New York Post and the New York Daily News do today. They eagerly disseminated stories furnished by the junta and undoubtedly contributed to a war spirit. In the time he took office in 1897, President William McKinley was absorbed in the Cuban problem. He patiently negotiated with Spain for almost 2 years, holding off domestic pressures of war. But two incidents in early 1898 brought the two nations to the brink of conflict. On February 9th, Hearst's New York World published a letter written by Enrique Dupuy de Lome, the Spanish minister in Washington, to friends in Cuba, describing McKinley as weak and a bidder for a crowd and speaking cynically of Spain's promises of reforms in Cuba. It was a private letter, of course, and Americans themselves had publicly said much worse things about McKinley. But in the supercharged atmospheres of 1898, this insult provoked popular outrage. More important, De Lome's cynical comments about reforms caused McKinley to doubt Spain's good faith. Less than a week later, the battleship USS Maine mysteriously exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 266 American sailors. McKinley had sent a ship there a few months earlier to protect American lives and property in the event that Cuba's struggle for independence from Spain might escalate into full-blown warfare. The catastrophe almost certainly resulted from an internal explosion, but Americans pinned responsibility elsewhere. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain became a popular rallying cry. Without bothering to examine the facts, the press blamed the explosion on Spain. Theater audiences wept, stamped their feet, and cheered when patriotic songs were played. Jingos wrapped themselves in flags and demanded war. McKinley insisted that Spain must get out of Cuba or face war. In Spain also, opposition to concessions grew. The Spanish resented being blamed for the Maine. The threat of U.S. intervention in Cuba provoked among students, middle-class urbanites, and even some working-class people a surge of patriotism not unlike that in the United States. By modern military standards, the War of 1898 did not amount to much. On the U.S. side, the last vestiges of 19th century volunteerism and amateurism collided with an incipient 20th century military professionalism, creating confusion, mismanagement, and indeed at times comic opera. Volunteers responded in such numbers that they could not be absorbed by an antiquated military bureaucracy. Large numbers of troops languished in squalid camps where they fought each other and eventually drifted home. Americans arrived in Cuba's tropical summer sun in woolen uniforms left over from the Civil War. They were fed a form of canned beef variously described as embalmed and nauseating. The U.S. commander, General William Shafter, weighed more than 300 pounds and resembled a floating tent. Mounting his horse required a complicated system of ropes and pulleys, a feat of real engineering ingenuity. Despite ineptitude and mismanagement, victory came easily, causing journalist Richard Harding Davis to observe that God looked after drunkards, babies, and Americans. With McKinley's approval, Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt had ordered Admiral George Dewey's fleet to steam to the Philippines at the outset of the war. In a smashing victory that set the tone for and came to symbolize the war, Dewey's 6 new warships crushed the decrepit Spanish squadron in Manila Bay in the Philippines, which was then part of the Spanish Empire. The attack set off wild celebrations at home, sealed the doom of Spain's empire in the Philippines, and created an opportunity for enthusiasm about expansion. Victory in Cuba, though, did not come so quick, but still not overly difficult. United States forces landed near Santiago without resistance, the result of luck as much as design. But they met stubborn Spanish resistance while advancing inland, and in taking the city, suffered heavy losses from Spanish fire and especially disease. Exhausted from 3 years of fighting Cubans, Spanish forces had no desire to take on fresh U.S. troops. Food shortages, mounting debt, political disarray, and a conspicuous lack of support from the European great powers sapped Spain's enthusiasm for war. It took less than 4 months for U.S. forces to conquer Cuba, just as disease began to disseminate the invading force. Victory cost a mere 345 killed in action, 5,000 lost to illness, and an estimated $250 million. The ease and decisiveness of the victory intoxicated Americans, stoking an already overheated chauvinism. It was a splendid little war, Ambassador John Hay declared from London. McKinley used the war to advance America's status as a world power and achieve its expansionist objectives. He set out to remove Spain from the Western Hemisphere, completing a process begun 100 years earlier. And he used the exigencies of war to fulfill the old aim of annexing Hawaii. The United States and Spain quickly signed a preliminary peace agreement in which Spain agreed to liberate Cuba and cede Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States. But what would happen to the Philippines? Initially, the United States aimed to keep only Manila because of its fine harbor. Manila was not defensible, however, without the whole island of Luzon on which it sat. After deliberating, McKinley found a justification for annexing all of the Philippines. He decided that we cannot leave the Filipinos to themselves. They were unfit for self-rule. Annexation was not as simple as U.S. policymakers had expected. On February 4, 1899, 2 days before the Senate ratified the treaty, fighting broke out between American and Filipino patrols on the edge of Manila. Confronted by annexation, rebel leader Emilio Aguinaldo, asserted his nation's independence and turned his guns on occupying American forces. Though Aguinaldo found it difficult to organize a mass-based resistance movement, the ensuing conflict between Filipino nationalists and U.S. troops far exceeded in length and ferocity the war just concluded with Spain. Fighting tenacious guerrillas, the U.S. Army resorted to the same tactics Spain had employed in Cuba, burning crops and villages and rounding up civilians. Atrocities became commonplace on both sides. In 3 years of warfare, 4,200 Americans and an estimated 200,000 Filipinos died. Many of the latter were dislocated civilians, particularly children who succumbed to malnutrition and disease. McKinley's convincing victory over William Jennings Bryan in the 1900 presidential election suggested popular satisfaction with America's overseas adventures, even in the face of dogged Filipino resistance to U.S. rule. The fighting ended in 1902 when William Howard Taft, appointed as Governor General of the Philippines, sought to make the territory a model of road building and sanitary engineering. Yet misgivings lingered as Americans confronted the brutality of war. Constitutional issues also remained unresolved. The treaty, while guaranteeing freedom of religion to inhabitants of ceded Spanish territories, withheld any promise of citizenship. It was up to Congress to decide Filipino civil rights and political status. In 1901, the Supreme Court upheld this provision in a set of decisions known as the Insular Cases. The Constitution, declared the court, did not automatically extend citizenship to people in acquired territories. Congress could decide. Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines were thus marked as colonies, not future states. The next year, as a condition of withdrawing from Cuba, the United States forced the newly independent island to accept a provision in its constitution called the Platt Amendment. This blocked Cuba from making a treaty with any country except the United States and gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuban affairs if it saw fit. Cuba also granted the United States a lease at Guantanamo Bay, still in effect, where the U.S. Navy built a large base. No one appreciated America's emerging influence more than the man who, after William McKinley's assassination, became president in 1901. Theodore Roosevelt was an avid student of world affairs who called on the civilized and orderly powers to insist on the proper policing of the world. He meant, in part, directing the affairs of backwards peoples. For Roosevelt, imperialism went hand in hand with domestic progressivism. He argued that a strong federal government, asserting itself both at home and abroad, would enhance economic stability and political order. In part 2, we'll look at Roosevelt's effort to expand American influence overseas and how his successors, William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson, adopted policies that propelled the United States into a major world power.